Hello, everyone. Dr. Sarah, your brain gal here, and I'm happy to be here today. And it's such an interesting day because I've had this topic scheduled for a while, but given the events of the Oscars, I think it's even more important to talk about losing it, right? And what that means, from a brain-based perspective. And if we think about Will Smith on the Oscars for just a minute, I just want you to think about something, and we're going to talk about it from a brain-based perspective. So my question to you is, what Will Smith did right or wrong? Maybe you're answering me out loud right now. Maybe you're thinking about it in your head. But if you said, I don't know, maybe a little of both, you're going to be really interested in what I have to say today, because our brains want this to be right or wrong. Our brains want to compartmentalize things into two different areas. It's either all right or all wrong. But our brains are also capable of thinking about the layers to this event with Will Smith the other night at the Oscars. So again, I ask you, was it right or was it wrong? So think about that and we'll come back to it, because what I first want to do is talk about what happened in the brain. What's happening in the brain when we lose it? So I brought my trusty brain here. And so as you can see, this is the back of the brain. This is the front of the brain here. And what I want to show you is the center of the brain here. And right here, you see my visual skills, I have to turn it around, is a part of your brain called the amygdala. You've heard me talk maybe a little bit about her before. I call her Amy G because she's just so emotional. She's our emotion center of the brain. So she is the one deep inside the brain here, because emotions are so important to the brain. And then up here is the part of our brain called the frontal lobe. This is Franny. I call her Franny, and I actually have pictures of them. So Amy G, I picture like a little puffer fish. Like if you have a preteen, you'll know who I'm talking about. If you walk on eggshells, she'll cough up and look something like this to you. I'll just show you a little picture I happen to have on my desk because I just talked to a class about this. And Franny, the frontal lobe, I picture her kind of like this. She's got her hand in everything, doing everything that she possibly can. So this is Franny, and you got your Amy G, and they're in this constant discussion, Franny and Amy G. So Franny and Amy G constantly going back and forth. Franny is your regulation center of your brain. Your frontal lobe is your regulation center. Amy G is supposed to feel emotions. So what you have when you get really emotional is a feeling that starts deep inside your brain that has to be regulated and controlled by Franny, by the frontal lobe. So we have this constant push-pull here. We want some stability with Amy G, because if Amy G isn't stable, we are going to have some trouble controlling her and regulating her. Because Franny's other jobs includes regulating and controlling behavior and thoughts, as well as emotions, as well as our motor movements. All control happens through Franny. So when we lose it, that means Franny is having some trouble here. Franny's got a lot of jobs. So she can't regulate Amy G while also think logically and problem solve and make the best decisions. So when we talk about someone losing it, what we're really talking about is Franny having some trouble. When it comes to adults, Franny can have trouble because they're stressed already, because there's a high level of emotion. Or maybe Franny could be having trouble because there's been some alcohol involved, which will reduce Franny's ability to take control. Or maybe it's just layers and layers and layers of stress and lots of years of learning. So what can happen here is that for something like the Oscars, where your emotion is really, really high to begin with, where you're wondering if you're going to win, this movie is so important for so many reasons. You're so invested in this movie that your Amy G is already heightened, and Franny is already working really hard to try to help to control that. So when Will Smith lost it, what happened was his Amy G won. Amy G, she won out. And Franny wasn't there to stop her. No matter how many arms poor Franny has, Amy G won. And thanks, Jenny. It's so nice to see you. So when Amy G poofs like that, it takes over the brain. Something really essential to our brain for so many reasons. It helps us figure out what to go towards and what to go away. But when Franny can't control Amy G, we have a problem. So what we had was lots of buildup of emotion already up. And then Franny not being able to regulate. So that's what we see this. So I go back to that question of, was it right or was it wrong? Understanding the brain helps us understand what's happening. Now, on the other side, we have Chris Rock, right? Who is making a joke that goes directly to a pain point of somebody in the audience. And I recognize that this is kind of his thing, that he does this. But the question is, where is that line? So when you know that you're going to hit something that is very emotional for someone, is that right or is that wrong? And who is responsible? Whose Franny is responsible at that point? And I think that that's what's really interesting about this interaction here. Do we condone violence? Absolutely not. Do we ever hit people? Absolutely not. Does our society condone violence? Generally not. However, our major problems are really solved with aggression, with heightened emotional response and physical response in particular. Wars, right? Death penalty. We have these things built in. We can't just ignore that these things aren't part of human nature. And so, am I likening this to that? Absolutely not. But my point is to say that there is a bigger picture here. Is it right or is it wrong is not always as black and white. Although our brains want us to have a black and white component to it, because compartmentalizing decisions like this makes it easier for our brain to handle. Franny says this or this, puts it in the middle of the brain, doesn't have to deal with it again. When we don't have a yes or no response, Franny is still involved and Amy G is still involved. And so we constantly battle. The other point I want to make about this is that Will Smith has been very clear about his history and how he grew up. And because I'm a pediatric neuropsychologist and we talk a lot about raising kids, I want to put some context to this because it's really important when we consider how we are as parents and how we grow and develop and what our brains learn. So he's been very open about his experiences as a young child with the abuse that was in his household. So watching his father abuse his mother and the regrets that he has about not stepping in. This is a long-standing thing. And I don't know Will Smith and I don't know the specific situation, but I can tell you that kids who've had this abuse in their household, as much as they may want to run away from that scenario, there is an imprinted memory, an imprinted learned experience about what aggression is used for too. And do you know when those things come back to us? At times of really, really heightened emotion, when we're extremely stressed and overwhelmed, we go back to things that we learned, these old patterns of learned responses too. So this, what happens with Will Smith has so many layers to it, because it shows us from a brain-based perspective all of the layers of growth and development that happen in our brain and what leads us to certain moments. So is it right to physically hit somebody? Absolutely not. Does it open a discussion about Franny and Amy G and the regulation of emotions and how important it is to be a good model young and to help to teach our kids what a good emotional regulation is? Absolutely. Now, your next question might be, well, how do we learn how to regulate those things? And what I would tell you is it's about insight. So it is about understanding what your trigger points are so that Franny can help to regulate them and Amy G can be kept at bay. So if Chris Rock had said, hey, I'm going to make a joke about this. I know it's a pain point, but I'm just going to warn you. We would not have seen what we saw. They may not have liked it. It may not have been something that they would have approved of, but they would have been prepared to understand what was going to happen and decide how they wanted to respond because their Frannies would have taken over. But the way it was presented was in such a way to trigger Amy G that Amy G did her puffer fish move, puffed up completely, and then Amy G is running the show. Franny is nowhere to be found. So for all of the people that are saying, that is not okay, and we should shun him, and this is unacceptable, and how could you do this? I would challenge you to say, look back at your life. I guarantee you've had an Amy G moment. I guarantee you've had a pufferfish moment where something has taken over, just hasn't been on national television. So again, I'm not saying it's right, but I understand what happened, and it was a series of events that led to this. So as we think about emotion regulation and losing it, We're talking not about Amy G. Amy G felt the right things there. Franny is the one that wasn't able to control that response. And therefore, we got an Amy G response instead of a Franny response. So as you think about talking to your kids about this incident, I would encourage you, don't go black and white on this. As my son said, when I asked him, and we had this conversation about it last night, he was a little right and he was a little wrong. That's okay. You can still teach your kids things by hanging in the gray. As a matter of fact, I think you can teach them more by hanging in the gray, because this incident opened up a huge number of doors for conversations about alopecia in general. And if you haven't seen my girlfriend McKenna's work, go take a look at her. I will link her to this because she speaks so elegantly about what that experience has been like for her. We know this is a major pain point. We shouldn't go right at major pain points for people. Have some humanity and talk about that. And if you still think that's the right thing to do, then you should go and give somebody's Amy G a little bit of warning. And if you didn't do that, well, you're going to see the consequence of that. So we have to thoroughly understand this incident. Thank you for commenting about this. I'm glad that you enjoy this, but this is the layers of this incident. This poor man had so many past experiences. This is the height, such an emotional night for him for so many reasons. If you've read things about Will Smith, again, not saying hitting somebody is right, but I understand it. And by understanding it, we can become better. He can become better. And our kids can become better and grow their brains in a way that we couldn't have done without this particular example. So again, for those of you who want to put this in a box of right or wrong, I'd encourage you, start hanging in the gray a little bit. Talk about the depth to this issue. Talk about what it means, because not only are you going to grow your Amy G pathways, your Amy G and Franny, and strengthen those, but you're going to create that insight and understanding. And that is what helps us to control our emotions in the long run. How do you feel about this? Why? What are the triggers that you're having about Amy G? And interestingly enough, what I've seen is the people that have the strongest no reaction to this are the people who I've seen had their Amy G's triggered the most. They're the most emotional and passionate about these things. And if you gain some insight and look back, again, I bet you find your pufferfish Amy G moment and you can gain some understanding into what's happened with this. So, there may be consequences to this. There probably should be consequences to this, but understanding where it comes from allows us to really have an interesting conversation about emotions and regulation of emotions and losing it. And also a conversation about understanding people are not perfect. Will Smith is not a perfect human. I'm sure he'd be the first person to say that. I am not a perfect human. You are not a perfect human. People make mistakes, and they make mistakes because our brains are designed to respond to these things. They're designed to respond emotionally. Amy G should get triggered at times because that's our sign of what is important and what isn't important. This is important. It's important to talk about. It's important to make sure we understand Amy G and Franny's connection. And I hope that this encourages you to gain your insight into your triggers and help Franny to be able to regulate your Amy G. And if and when your Amy G gets out of hand, be understanding of what and why and learn something from that, because that's the only thing that we can do at that point if you're doing the work to really understand that pathway. So I hope that was helpful. I hope it added to your understanding of this. And remember, we all lose it. And when we lose it, our Amy G, our pufferfish is the one really to blame here. So nice talking to you all today. If you have questions or comments, I would love to hear them below, especially because I'm encouraging talking about the layers of this and the depth to this, but you have to do it with an understanding of the brain and what happens in our brains when we get triggered.